Before we begin this story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other mysterious tales and intriguing stories like this one. Here, you will find real cases, little-known mysteries, and events that often defy explanation. And now, I want to know from you, where are you watching this video from? Leave the name of your city and country in the comments. It's always amazing to see how far these stories reach. Deep in the Pennsylvania countryside, far from busy roads and brightly lit cities, lay a property that seemed forgotten by time. Surrounded by high, dark stone walls and ancient trees that blocked almost all sunlight, the area occupied a vast expanse of land that few dared even look directly at. The residents of the small rural community of Hawthorne Ridge had a curious habit. When passing by the road that bordered the property, they would look away. Some slowed down their cars, others discreetly accelerated, as if the mere proximity to the place caused discomfort. The reason wasn't superstition, at least not officially. For decades, no one really knew who lived there. The property had been built in the late 1970s by a man named Daniel Whitaker. A reserved businessman arrived in the region with a lot of money and few explanations. He bought more than 50 hectares of land, and within a few months, construction crews began erecting high walls, almost 4 meters tall, made of solid stone. The detail that stood out the most was that the walls were built even before the house. For weeks, trucks carrying stone and concrete entered the site while workers avoided talking to the townspeople. When they finally finished the job, a huge iron gate was installed at the property's only entrance. After that, the house began to take shape. It was a large mansion, but strangely discreet for someone so wealthy. No luxurious towers, no ornamental gardens, no attempt whatsoever to impress those outside. The building seemed designed for only one purpose: keep everything within the property, away from outside eyes. At first, the residents of Hawthorne Ridge tried to dismiss it as just another eccentricity of someone wealthy. After all, people with money usually liked their privacy. But they soon realized that something was different. Daniel Whitaker was rarely seen. He would only show up in town a few times a month to buy basic supplies, tools, fuel, canned food, and occasionally building materials. He never stayed in the stores for more than a few minutes. He spoke little, I always paid in cash, and he never answered questions. The first person to seriously find his behavior strange was Thomas Reed, owner of the only grocery store in town. Thomas knew everyone in the area. He was the kind of man who remembered the names of families, children, and even dogs. But Daniel Whitaker seemed determined to remain a stranger. "Do you live on that property on the hill?" Thomas asked once, trying to start a conversation. Whitaker simply nodded. "Too big a place for just one person." The man placed the groceries on the counter, took some bills from his pocket, and calmly replied, "That's exactly why I bought it." It was the only complete sentence Thomas had heard from him in years. Over time, other details began to bother the residents. At night, some people said they saw bright lights moving inside the property. Others reported hearing metallic sounds echoing beyond the walls, as if machines were operating in the middle of the night. But nobody was sure. The walls were too high, the trees are too dense, and the gate always remained closed. Time passed. Years turned into decades, and gradually the place gained a quiet reputation in the region. Drivers avoided stopping near the gate. Children were warned not to go near. Hunters who ventured into the nearby forests always kept their distance from the property. But no one has ever been able to explain it. Why? There were no records of crimes, there were no complaints. There was no proof of anything, just a persistent feeling that something inside wasn't right. Among all the residents of Hawthorne Ridge, only one person seemed truly determined to understand what went on behind those walls. His name was Ethan Carter. Ethan was 32 years old and had returned to the city after spending years working as an investigative journalist in Philadelphia. He didn't believe in vague stories or rumors without evidence. But one thing always caught his attention. Throughout his childhood, he remembered hearing the same phrase repeated by the adults in the city: "Do not approach that property." No one ever explained the reason. And for Ethan, this was exactly the kind of thing that deserved to be investigated. What really lay behind those walls? Why would a wealthy man live in isolation for decades with virtually no contact with the outside world? And above all, why did an entire city seem to avoid talking about it? On that cold October morning, Ethan parked his car on the dirt road that led to the property gate. For the first time in over 40 years, someone was about to look directly at the place everyone else preferred to ignore. And he still didn't know that some answers could be far more disturbing than any mystery. The small town of Hawthorne Ridge was never known for grand events. Surrounded by vast fields, ancient forests, and small rural roads that seemed to disappear on the horizon, the place lived at a slow, almost predictable pace. Most residents worked in agriculture, in small workshops, or in family businesses that had existed for generations. Everyone knew each other by name. The town's stories were passed down orally as part of the local culture, and inevitably all these stories ended up touching on a subject that nobody liked to discuss for very long: the property surrounded by walls on the hill. For many long-time residents, that place was already part of the landscape. They grew up seeing the high, dark stone walls and the always-closed iron gate. It was as constant as the trees or the surrounding hills. But for Ethan Carter, that never seemed normal. He had grown up hearing snippets of comments during conversations between adults, always interrupted when children approached. Some said the property owner had been an extremely paranoid man. Others believed he simply wanted to live in isolation. But there were also stranger stories. A former truck driver from the city swore that one time in the middle of the night, he saw trucks entering the property carrying large metal crates. Another resident said he had heard the sounds of machinery operating at night for years. None of this has ever been confirmed. And it was precisely this lack of answers that sparked Ethan's curiosity. After parking his car near the road leading to the property gate, he decided to begin his investigation in the simplest way possible: talking to people in the city. The first stop was the grocery store, Thomas Reed. The small lumber market had been on the main corner of town for over 40 years. The place had a constant smell of coffee, old wood, and cardboard boxes. Thomas was behind the counter when Ethan walked in. "Ethan Carter," the man said, recognizing him immediately. "It's been a while since you've been around here." Ethan smiled. "I came back to visit my mother and maybe investigate a few things." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Investigate?" Ethan rested his arms on the counter. "The Hill property." For a few seconds, Thomas did not respond. The silence seemed too heavy for such a simple question. Finally, the man sighed and looked out the window, as if to confirm that no one else was listening. "You've always been too curious for your own good," Ethan chuckled lightly. "That's part of the job." Thomas remained silent for a few seconds before speaking again. "Daniel Whitaker showed up here in the late 70s, out of nowhere. He bought half the land in that region. He paid for it all in cash. Did he live alone?" "From what we knew, yes." Thomas began wiping the counter with a cloth while continuing to talk, but there were strange things. "Like what?" "Trucks." Ethan leaned in a little closer, intrigued. "What kind of trucks?" "Industrialists, large companies. Some came from cities like Pittsburgh and Cleveland." "And what were they carrying?" Thomas shrugged. "Boxes, equipment. We never saw exactly what it was." "And then what?" "After a few years, they stopped showing up." Ethan became thoughtful. "But did the lights stay on?" Thomas looked directly at him. "Have you heard about this too?" Some people commented. Thomas took a deep breath. "Some nights, It seemed like there were spotlights moving inside the property, as if someone was working in there. But nobody ever went in? Thomas shook his head. No one was invited. Ethan left the grocery store with even more questions than before. If Daniel Whitaker had built the property solely to live in isolation, why would he have brought so much industrial equipment there? And why did everything seem to stop after a few years? In the following days, Ethan spoke with several people in the city. One of them was Margaret Collins, a 78-year-old woman who had lived in the area since before the property was built. She clearly remembered the period when the walls were being built. "That didn't look like a house being built," she said. "It looked like a fortress. Did you happen to see Whitaker?" "Only twice. What was he like?" Margaret thought for a moment. "Quiet, always looking around, as if he were afraid of something." That description stuck in Ethan's mind. Fear, but afraid of what? A few days later, Ethan decided to approach the property again. The dirt road leading to the gate was partially covered with dry leaves. It was clear that almost no one had passed through there for a long time. When he finally reached the iron gate, he noticed something curious. There was old cameras installed on the stone pillars, surveillance cameras. Even after decades, they were still there. And then Ethan noticed something even stranger. Despite the apparent neglect of the place, the padlock on the gate, it wasn't rusty. That meant only one thing: someone could still be going in and out of that property. And for the first time since he began his investigation, Ethan felt a slight sense of unease. Because if Daniel Whitaker really was living in isolation there, so someone still needed to be keeping that place running. And the entire city seemed to have ignored this possibility for years. The next morning, Ethan returned to the road that led to the walled property on the outskirts of Hawthorne Ridge. The sky was covered with heavy clouds, and the cold autumn wind swept through the ancient trees that surrounded the land. This time, he didn't intend to just observe. I wanted to find something concrete. The iron gate remained closed, imposing, with the stone walls stretching to both sides until they disappeared into the vegetation. Even standing outside, it was possible to feel the strange silence that dominated the place. There were no animal sounds, no movement. Nothing. Ethan walked slowly along the wall, following the line of the construction. In some places, the trees were so close that their branches almost touched the stone. After a few minutes, he found something unexpected: marks on the floor. They weren't recent, but they didn't look very old either. They were deep tire tracks, partially covered by dry leaves. Trucks. That confirmed part of what Thomas had said at the grocery store. But what really caught Ethan's attention was something else. The marks. They weren't just going inside the property. They went out too. He took some photos with his cell phone. If vehicles were still entering there, someone must have been using that space. But who? Daniel Whitaker would be over 80 years old by now, if he was still alive. And even if he were, it would be difficult to imagine a man of that age operating alone on a property of that size. Ethan returned to the car, but his mind was already racing with various possibilities. That afternoon, he decided to visit the county public archives in the nearby town of Lancaster. The small administrative building was quiet, filled with metal cabinets and old documents. An employee named Claire Donovan helped him locate property records for the region. "Are you researching Whitaker's property?" she asked, seeing the address. "Yes. I'm trying to understand a bit about the history of the place." Claire opened some digital files on the computer. "Well, officially it still belongs to Daniel Whitaker. Yet, there was never a transfer of ownership." Ethan frowned. No inheritance, no sale, nothing recorded. She continued researching, "But there's something curious here." "What?" "In the 1980s, the property received several licenses for the transportation of industrial equipment." "What type of equipment?" Claire enlarged the document. "Generators, compressors, heavy metal parts." Ethan remained silent for a few seconds. That didn't make sense for a detached house. "This looks more like factory equipment," he said. Claire agreed. "Or from a laboratory." The word kept echoing in Ethan's mind. Laboratory. When he left the building, he already had a new theory. Perhaps Daniel Whitaker hadn't built that property simply to live in isolation. Perhaps it was working on something. But what exactly? That night, Ethan returned to the road that ran near the property. This time he stayed inside the car, parked some distance away, watching the gate. The clock was almost showing midnight when something finally happened. First came a distant sound, an engine, and then, slowly emerging down the dark road, a truck appeared. Ethan felt his heart race. The vehicle moved forward slowly until it stopped in front of the gate. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then something unexpected happened. The gate began to open by itself. The two enormous iron doors moved slowly, creaking in the silence of the night. The truck entered. Soon after, the gate closed again. Ethan stood there, staring at the place. This meant that someone was controlling the gate from the inside, or there was some kind of automated system still functioning. But the most important thing was something else. That proved that the property it was not abandoned. Suddenly, a bright light appeared from behind the walls, illuminating some of the surrounding trees. Reflectors. Exactly as some residents had described it years ago. Ethan picked up his cell phone and started recording. For almost 20 minutes he watched the light move slowly inside the property. Large shadows appeared, projected onto the treetops. Shadows that looked like machines. That was impossible to ignore. If someone was operating industrial equipment inside, it meant that an entire activity was taking place without the city knowing. Or worse, maybe someone I didn't want the city to know. When he finally decided to leave, Ethan realized something that made his unease grow even more. As he started the car, he had a distinct feeling that he wasn't the only one watching that road. For a brief second, looking in the rear-view mirror, he thought he saw movement near the trees on the other side of the road. A silhouette. Stop. Observing. But when he looked again, there was no one there anymore. And, for the first time since he began investigating the property, Ethan started to wonder if he was getting closer to something much bigger than he had imagined. In the days that followed, Ethan Carter began organizing everything he had discovered about the walled property on the outskirts of Hawthorne Ridge. Photographs of the gate, records of equipment transport, and notes on residents' accounts began to fill the small makeshift office in his mother's house. Every detail seemed to confirm one thing: that property had never been just a house. But the central piece of the puzzle was still missing. What exactly was happening inside? While reviewing documents obtained from the Lancaster Public Archives, Ethan noticed something that had previously gone unnoticed. Some of the industrial transportation licenses registered in the 1980s originated from companies located in Pittsburgh and Cleveland. These cities were known for their strong metallurgical industry, but the type of equipment listed in the records was not typical of ordinary factories. There were parts associated with hydraulic compression, molding of special alloys, and high-capacity power generation systems. For an investigative journalist like Ethan, that suggested something very specific: small-scale production, but highly specialized. He decided to look for someone who could help him better interpret those documents. That's how he got in touch with Lucas Bennett, a former college classmate who now worked as an industrial engineer in Philadelphia. When Ethan sent the photos of the records, Lucas responded a few hours later. The answer was short, but enough to deepen the mystery even further. "This looks like equipment of industrial prototyping." Ethan called him immediately. "Prototyping what?" he asked. Lucas thought for a few seconds before answering. "It's difficult to say exactly. But this type of machinery is typically used to develop parts that are still in development. They don't exist on the market." "As experimental projects?" Exactly. That opened up a new possibility. Perhaps Daniel Whitaker was not just an isolated man. Perhaps it was someone involved in some kind of private technological development. But that raised another question. Whether it was an industrial or technological project, why hide it behind walls in the middle of a rural area? As Ethan continued his investigation, another small story began to emerge among the town's older residents. A story that had never been taken very seriously. Margaret Collins, the elderly lady who had recounted the construction of the property decades earlier, mentioned something curious during a second conversation. There was a fire many years ago. Ethan raised his head immediately. Fire? Yes. In the early 80s. She pointed vaguely towards the hills. People saw smoke coming from the property. Were the firefighters called? Margaret shook her head. No. Why? Because nobody could get in. The gate was locked and the walls were too high. Mr. Whitaker, he showed up in town the next day, buying building materials. As if nothing had happened. This story seemed small, but Ethan knew that events like this were rarely insignificant. Industrial fires generally meant failures, accidents, or experiments that went wrong. What if something like that had happened on that property? Perhaps that would explain why the place always seemed so isolated and secret. Meanwhile, another subplot began to emerge. The feeling that Ethan was being watched had not disappeared. On the third night he returned to the road near the property gate, he again noticed movement among the trees. This time it was clearer, a car, parked some distance from the main road, partially hidden by vegetation. Ethan decided to approach slowly. But before he could get close, the car turned on its headlights and sped off down the road, disappearing towards the highway. That raised even more questions. He wasn't the only one interested in that place. In the following days, Ethan discovered something even more intriguing while analyzing old financial records linked to the name Daniel Whitaker. Before purchasing the property in Hawthorne Ridge, Whitaker had worked as an engineer for a company located in Detroit, a company involved in advanced industrial development. But there was a strange detail. He left the company abruptly at the end of the 1970s. Without explanation, no new employment records after that. A few months later, he bought 50 hectares of land in rural Pennsylvania. He built walls, he installed industrial equipment, and he disappeared from the public eye. When Ethan organized all this information, a hypothesis slowly began to form. Perhaps Daniel Whitaker hadn't come to that region simply to live in isolation. Perhaps he had brought it, an entire project with him, something that demanded absolute privacy. Something that needed to be kept away from companies, authorities, and competitors. But there was a part of this story that still didn't make sense. If Whitaker had started this project 40 years earlier, why was there still activity on the property today? The answer to that question could completely change what Ethan thought about that place. And perhaps that would explain why, even after decades, no one approached those walls. For nearly 2 weeks, Ethan Carter discreetly observed the road leading to the walled property on the outskirts of Hawthorne Ridge. He noted times, recorded movements, and photographed any unusual activity. The pattern began to appear slowly. The trucks didn't arrive every night. But when they did appear, they always came late, usually between 11 at night and 2 in the morning, and they never stayed very long. They entered. They stayed for about 40 minutes. Then they would go out again. For Ethan, that indicated something very specific: fast deliveries. But deliveries of what? After watching the third truck enter the property that week, he made a decision he knew was risky. Instead of just watching from the road, he decided to follow one of the vehicles as it drove away. That night, the air was cold and damp. Fog covered part of the road, leaving the car headlights with a diffuse glow. Shortly after midnight, the truck reappeared. It was large, with no logo or visible identification. As on other occasions, the property gate opened slowly as the vehicle approached. The truck entered. 40 minutes later, the gate opened again. The truck left. Ethan started the car immediately. Keeping his distance, he began to follow the vehicle along the rural road that led to the highway. After about 20 minutes, the truck turned onto a secondary road that led out of the area. Soon a sign appeared indicating the direction to Harrisburg. But before reaching the city, the truck did something unexpected. He entered a small, abandoned industrial warehouse near the road. Ethan parked the car some distance away and observed. The lights in the shed came on. The metal door opened partially, and two men began unloading boxes from the truck, large boxes, made of metal. That seemed to confirm that some kind of production was taking place on Whitaker's property. But then something happened that completely changed the direction of the investigation. One of the men dropped one of the boxes on the floor. The lid opened partially. Ethan picked up the zoom camera he had brought. He adjusted the focus, and she froze when she saw what was inside. These were not ordinary industrial parts. They were small metal devices, extremely precise, full of connections and micro-components. They looked like advanced technological devices. Something that definitely shouldn't be produced in secret in the middle of a rural area. Ethan continued watching. One of the men quickly gathered the contents of the box and closed the lid. They seemed nervous, as if they were used to working with something that couldn't be seen, but the real shock was yet to come. While the men continued unloading the boxes, a third person came out of the warehouse. An elderly man, completely white hair, slow but steady movements. Ethan zoomed in with the camera, and he immediately recognized the face. Era Daniel Whitaker, but that was impossible. According to records, Whitaker should have been over 80 years old, and although he was clearly aging, he seemed surprisingly active, much more than someone of that age would normally be. Whitaker spoke briefly with the two men, pointing to some boxes and giving instructions. The workers seemed to treat him with extreme respect, or perhaps fear. After a few minutes, Whitaker went back inside the shed. Ethan felt his heart race. That confirmed two important things. First, Daniel Whitaker was still alive. Second, he was still directly involved in the activities that took place on the property. But the most important discovery came a few minutes later. When the truck finished unloading, one of the men opened another smaller box and quickly checked the contents. This time, Ethan managed to focus better with the camera. Inside the box were several devices similar to the previous ones, but one detail immediately caught our attention. Each one had a small mark engraved on the metal, a symbol, and below it, a code. Ethan enlarged the image, and what he read made his mind race with new possibilities. The code appeared to be military serial number, if that were correct. This meant that the devices were produced within Whitaker's property. They could be linked to military or government technology. But this raised an even more unsettling question. If that was a legitimate military project, why was it being produced in absolute secrecy, without any recent official record? What if it wasn't official? So what exactly was Daniel Whitaker building all those years behind the walls? As Ethan watched the warehouse from a distance, he still didn't know that this discovery was about to trigger something much bigger. Because at that very moment inside the warehouse, Daniel Whitaker had just discovered that someone was investigating his property, and he didn't intend to let that curiosity continue for long. The following morning, Ethan Carter woke up earlier than usual. The images recorded the previous night still occupied his mind intensely. The unexpected encounter with Daniel Whitaker in the shed near the road leading to Harrisburg had completely changed the course of the investigation. Now there was no more doubt. Whitaker was not only alive, he was still active, and more than that, he appeared to be commanding a secret technological operation that had begun decades earlier on the walled property outside Hawthorne Ridge. Ethan spent much of the morning analyzing the videos and photographs he had captured. He enlarged several images, trying to better understand the metallic devices that were being unloaded from the truck. The parts were small, extremely precise, and clearly manufactured with advanced technology. But there was one detail that wouldn't leave his mind: the serial number engraved on the metal. He decided to send some of the images to Lucas Bennett, his engineer friend in Philadelphia. A few hours later, Ethan's phone rang. Lucas seemed worried. "Where did you get that?" "In a place that shouldn't exist," Ethan replied. Lucas remained silent for a few seconds before speaking again. "These codes do follow a military standard, but they are not current. What does that mean?" "This means that this type of numbering was used in experimental government projects between the late 1970s and early 1980s. Ethan felt a chill run through his body. "What kind of projects?" "Advanced communication technologies and sensors, some connected to tracking and detection systems." That made sense. If Daniel Whitaker had worked in industrial engineering before disappearing from public life, perhaps he was involved in some experimental project. But there was still something strange. "If this was military technology," Ethan said, "why would it still be produced in secret today?" Lucas responded cautiously. "There are two possibilities. Which? Either Whitaker continued a project that was officially cancelled, either he's developing something that it should never have continued." Ethan hung up the phone with more questions than answers. Meanwhile, in the small town of Hawthorne Ridge, Ethan's constant presence began to attract attention. Some residents noticed that he was spending a lot of time on the roads near the walled property, and as always happened in small towns, rumors began to circulate. At Thomas Reed's grocery store, two people mentioned seeing an unfamiliar car parked near the Hill Road on several nights. Thomas listened to the conversation in silence. He had known Ethan since childhood, and I had a strange feeling that this investigation could end up causing problems for everyone. But the most immediate consequences began to emerge that same night. Ethan returned home after spending the day analyzing documents. As soon as he parked the car in front of the garage, something caught his attention. The wooden gate of the house was entreaberto. He was certain he had closed it before leaving. Ethan entered slowly. The house seemed too quiet. No signs of forced entry. Nothing seems out of place. But when he entered the small office where he kept his notes, he noticed something that made his heart race. Some of the photographs that he had printed were out of order. Someone had been messing with them. And on the table, there was something that definitely hadn't been there before. An envelope. No name, no sender. Ethan slowly opened the envelope. Inside, there was only a sheet of paper, a single typed sentence. "Some properties exist for a reason." He read it again. "Some properties exist for a reason." No direct threat, no signature. But the message was clear. Someone knew he was investigating. And more than that, someone had entered his house just to leave that warning. Ethan looked out the window toward the distant hills where Daniel Whitaker's property was located. Up until that point, his investigation had been driven solely by curiosity and a search for answers. But now the situation had changed, because if Whitaker or anyone else involved in that operation was willing to send such a direct warning, it meant that Ethan was very close to discovering something important, and it also meant that continuing to investigate could put him in a type of danger that he didn't yet fully understand. Even so, one thing was certain. After everything he had seen, Ethan knew he couldn't simply abandon the investigation. Because hidden behind those stone walls, there was a secret that had been protected for over 40 years. And now someone was willing to do anything to ensure he remained hidden. During the early morning hours, Ethan Carter barely slept. The phrase left on his desk kept echoing in his mind. Some properties exist for a reason. It wasn't a direct threat. There was no implied violence. Still, the message was disturbingly clear. Someone was watching his every move. For the first time since he began investigating the walled property on the outskirts of Hawthorne Ridge, Ethan realized he wasn't just dealing with a curious mystery. There were people protecting that secret. And possibly very powerful people. During the morning, he made an important decision. If he continued investigating alone, it would be very easy for someone to silence his findings. Then he began to change his approach. Instead of keeping everything only on his personal computer, Ethan created backups of all the documents, photos, and videos he had collected. He sent encrypted versions to 2 trusted contacts. One of them was Lucas Bennett in Philadelphia. The other one was Megan Walsh, an investigative journalist working at a major regional newspaper in New York. The message that Ethan sent to Megan was simple. If anything happens to me, investigate Daniel Whitaker. A few hours later, Megan replied. She had quickly reviewed some of the material that Ethan had sent. The answer was straightforward. This could be bigger than you think. Meanwhile, Ethan also began to study Daniel Whitaker's past more carefully. Old records showed that before disappearing from public life in the late 1970s, Whitaker had worked at a technology development center linked to the automotive industry in Detroit. But there was something even more interesting. Some of the projects Whitaker had participated in had indirect links to research conducted during the time of Cold War. Research related to advanced sensors and detection technologies. This partially explained the industrial equipment that Ethan had found in the property's transport records. Whitaker may have been developing proprietary experimental technology, but there was a problem with that theory. If the project had started 40 years ago, why was it still active? To try and answer that question, Ethan decided to do something he had avoided until then. He returned to the property, but this time he didn't just watch from the roadside. In the late afternoon, as the sky began to darken and the fog returned to cover the hills, Ethan walked through the forest that surrounded part of the stone wall. He knew the area was vast. Perhaps there was some spot where the vegetation allowed one to see part of the interior. After nearly 40 minutes of walking among trees and moss-covered rocks, he finally found something promising. One section of the wall looked older. The stones were partially displaced by the growth of tree roots. Carefully, Ethan climbed onto a fallen log nearby and managed to look over the structure, and what he saw on the other side made his breath catch for a moment. The property was not just an isolated house, era an entire complex. Several industrial warehouses were scattered across the site, generators, metal antennas, and structures that resembled laboratories. White lights illuminated part of the place, even as night was approaching. There was constant activity. People moved between the buildings. Small vehicles transported boxes between the warehouses. It seemed much bigger than anyone in the city had imagined. But the most surprising detail was in the center of the property. A tall, tower-like metal structure surrounded by equipment and thick cables connected to the ground. Ethan grabbed his camera and started recording everything. As he watched that secret facility operating silently behind the walls, an understanding slowly began to dawn on him. Daniel Whitaker had not simply built an isolated laboratory. He had created an entire project that had survived decades without public oversight. What if that was connected to the detection technologies mentioned by Lucas? Perhaps Whitaker was developing something capable to monitor or track signals on a large scale, something that could have military applications, or something even more complex. But as Ethan observed the metal tower in the center of the property, another thought began to surface. What if the goal of the project had he never been in the military? What if Daniel Whitaker had continued his work for his own reasons, reasons that no one outside those walls truly understood? Ethan slowly climbed down from the log. Now he had enough evidence to continue investigating. But he also knew he was rapidly approaching the truth, and the closer it got, everything seemed to be becoming more dangerous. Because somewhere inside that secret complex, Daniel Whitaker probably already knew that someone was watching, and this time perhaps he wouldn't just limit himself to leaving warnings. After discovering the hidden complex behind the walls of the Hawthorne Ridge property, Ethan Carter realized that his investigation had reached a point of no return. Now he knew that this place was not just an isolated house. It was an active technological facility, operating for decades without any public oversight, and the more he analyzed the images he had captured of the metal tower in the center of the property, the clearer it became that this was the heart of Daniel Whitaker's project. The following morning, Ethan sent the more detailed photographs to Lucas Bennett in Philadelphia. The response took longer than expected. When he finally arrived, Lucas seemed much more cautious than before. "That tower you photographed," he said during the call, "doesn't just look like a transmitter. What else could it be?" Lucas hesitated before answering. "It could be part of a system of detection of high-frequency signals." "What kind of signs?" "It's difficult to say, but equipment of this type is often used to monitor communications, radar, or even experimental transmissions." Ethan remained silent for a few seconds. If Whitaker really was developing an advanced signal detection system, this would explain why the project had started during the years of Cold War. But there was still something that didn't make sense. "Lucas," Ethan said, "why continue a project like this for 40 years? On the other end of the line, the engineer responded with a disturbing hypothesis, perhaps because it's not over. This possibility made Ethan realize something he hadn't considered until then. Perhaps Whitaker had been working on it for all those decades, a single technology, something complex enough to take a lifetime to develop. But to confirm anything, Ethan needed more concrete evidence. Then he made the riskiest decision of the entire investigation. He was going to enter the property, not during the night, when trucks and workers were present, but during the early morning hours. On previous nights, Ethan had observed that between 3 and 5 in the morning, the movement within the property decreased drastically. It was the only time the complex seemed almost silent. That same night, he began to prepare. He gathered small flashlights, a camera with a night vision lens, and a recorder. He also sent a new message to Megan Walsh, the journalist in New York. This time, the message was more direct. "I'm going to enter the property tonight." Megan's reply came a few minutes later. "Ethan, think carefully. If this project is truly sensitive, you could be putting yourself in a very dangerous situation." But Ethan had already made his decision. Shortly after 2 in the morning, he parked the car on a side road near the forest that surrounded part of the wall. The sky was completely dark. Clouds obscured the moon, making the landscape even more silent. Ethan walked through the same stretch of woods he had explored the previous day. This time, however, he did not stop at the point where he could observe the property. He continued walking along the wall. After almost 15 minutes, he found something he had noticed briefly before, a section where the stone structure appeared to have been recently repaired, but the dense vegetation around concealed a small opening between the rocks. Perhaps it was used years ago for maintenance, or perhaps simply forgotten. Carefully, Ethan moved aside some branches and managed to squeeze through the narrow space. When he finally crossed the wall, he felt a mixture of adrenaline and apprehension. For the first time in decades, someone from the outside was there. Inside Daniel Whitaker's property, the land was much larger than it appeared from the outside. The industrial buildings were scattered across the site, connected by small dirt roads. Dim lights illuminated some areas, but much of the property remained in semi-darkness. Ethan moved slowly among the trees, avoiding open areas. From a distance, he could clearly see the metal tower in the center of the facility. Thick cables extended from the base of the structure and spread across the ground in various directions. Approaching that tower seemed to be the only way to truly understand what Whitaker was building. But before Ethan could make much more progress, something unexpected happened. One of the nearby warehouses turned on its lights. The metal door opened slowly, and a familiar figure appeared at the entrance. Daniel Whitaker. Even from a distance, Ethan immediately recognized the man he had seen in the shed days before. Whitaker looked directly toward the forest, as if he knew exactly where Ethan was. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Then Whitaker took a few steps outside the building, and he said something aloud in the silence of the early morning. "You took longer than I expected to come in." Ethan felt his heart race. That meant only one thing. Whitaker knew about the research from the beginning, perhaps even before Ethan began observing the property, and now there was no going back now. The silence that followed Daniel Whitaker's words seemed to spread throughout the walled property at Hawthorne Ridge. Ethan Carter remained motionless among the trees. For a few seconds, he tried to convince himself that Whitaker wasn't really talking to him, but the way the old engineer stared directly into the darkness of the forest left no doubt. He knew. Whitaker walked a few steps ahead of the shed, stopping under the white light that illuminated the grounds. Even from a distance, Ethan could clearly see her calm expression. There was no anger, not a surprise, just a strange tranquility. "You can leave," Whitaker said. "If I intended to prevent you from entering, my security systems would have done so hours ago." The statement made Ethan even more wary. Even so, he knew that continuing to hide no longer made sense. Slowly, he emerged from behind the trees. The dim light of the complex revealed his face. Whitaker watched Ethan intently, as if confirming something he already suspected. "Ethan Carter," he said casually. "I figured it would be you." Ethan frowned. "Do you know me?" Whitaker gave a slight smile. "In small towns like Hawthorne Ridge, it's impossible not to meet someone who starts asking a lot of questions." Ethan took a deep breath. "So you knew I was investigating? From the first day you parked your car on the hill road?" That confirmed something Ethan had already feared. Throughout that time, he wasn't just observing the property was also watching him. Whitaker made a simple gesture with his hand. "Come." After a brief moment of hesitation, Ethan walked over to him. The closer proximity revealed even more details. Despite his advanced age, Whitaker seemed incredibly lucid. His eyes were attentive, almost curious. "You saw the tower?" said the engineer. Ethan nodded. "And he also saw the devices being transported?" "Yes." Whitaker looked at the metal structure in the center of the property. The tower rose silently against the dark sky. "For decades," he began, "people believed that I had simply disappeared." He paused briefly. "The truth is, I never stopped working." Whitaker began to walk slowly towards the tower. Ethan followed him. As they got closer, the cables and equipment surrounding the structure became increasingly complex. "In the 1970s, Whitaker continued, "I participated in projects related to signal detection and experimental technologies during the period of Cold War." He lightly touched one of the metal panels installed around the tower. "But the government abandoned these projects too soon." "Why?" Ethan asked. Whitaker answered without hesitation, "Because they believed the results would take too long." He looked directly at Ethan. "But I knew they were wrong." Whitaker pointed to the top of the tower. "This system was designed to detect extremely rare signal patterns." "What kind of signs?" The engineer remained silent for a moment. Then he responded in a surprising way. "Signals that do not originate on Earth." Ethan stood motionless. "Are you talking about extraterrestrial transmissions?" Whitaker shook his head slowly. "Not exactly." He pressed a button on a nearby panel. The tower emitted a faint electric sound. Some of the equipment started to light up. "For 40 years, Whitaker explained, this system has monitored frequencies that no one else was observing." He looked back at Ethan. "And 3 months ago, he finally found something." Ethan felt a shiver run through his body. "What?" Whitaker responded with absolute composure. A pattern that repeats every 72 hours. A signal that comes from far beyond the solar system." The engineer pointed to a nearby monitor. Data lines and graphs moved slowly across the screen. We still don't know exactly what it means, but we know that's not natural. Ethan tried to process that information. For decades, a secret facility has been operating hidden behind those walls, just to detect a single signal coming from deep space. But before he could say anything, a soft alarm began to sound. Whitaker immediately looked at the monitor. The graph on the screen had changed. The pattern was reappearing. "It's early," Whitaker murmured. He observed the data carefully. This shouldn't be happening now. The signal on the screen began to grow rapidly. The tower emitted a louder sound. The cables vibrated slightly with the energy passing through them, and then something unexpected happened. A new pattern emerged in the data, a second signal, unlike the first one. Whitaker stared at the screen with an expression Ethan had never seen before. Surprise, perhaps even concern. "That doesn't make sense," he said. Ethan approached the monitor. "What is happening?" Whitaker answered slowly. "The system is detecting an answer." The silence that followed was heavy. If that were true, so the signal that Whitaker had detected was not just a random transmission, a part of a communication. And now, for the first time in 40 years, something had responded. As strange events accumulated, an unsettling feeling began to take over the house. It was no longer possible to ignore what was happening. What had previously seemed like mere coincidence, sleepless nights, inexplicable noises, sudden mood swings, now formed a disturbing pattern. The homeowner, who initially sought medical explanations for his extreme fatigue, began to realize that the problem might not be within him, but within the house itself. Some nights were particularly difficult. He would wake up at the same time, repeatedly, always with the same strange feeling, as if something were watching him. The silence of the early morning seemed heavy, almost oppressive, and any small noise echoed through the hallways like a warning. Objects would move around without clear explanation. Doors he was sure he had locked would appear open in the morning. And there were times when he swore he heard footsteps upstairs, even when he was alone in the house. The stress began to affect his daily routine. Friends and acquaintances noticed that he seemed different, more tired, more nervous, more distant. Some even asked if he was really okay. It was then that an inevitable question arose in his mind. What if all of that was related to the house's own history? That possibility seemed absurd, but it was also the only explanation that was beginning to make sense. Without realizing it, he was about to discover that the property held a past that few people knew about, and perhaps something that should never have been awakened. And the most disturbing thing of all was that at that point it might be too late to simply leave. Determined to find answers, the homeowner decided to investigate the property's history more deeply. That constant feeling that something was wrong could no longer be ignored. He needed to understand if there was any explanation for everything that was happening. The first attempt was to talk to long-time residents of the area. Some people showed immediate discomfort upon hearing the house's address. Others simply avoided answering, abruptly changing the subject. This strange silence seemed to hide something that no one wanted to say aloud. But one conversation, in particular, completely changed his perception of the place. An older resident, after hesitating for a few moments, revealed that the house had been known in the city long before he moved there. According to old accounts, inexplicable events always seemed to surround the property. Noises during the early morning hours, reports of strange presences, and residents who didn't stay there for very long. Intrigued, he decided to look for older records about the residents. Public documents, city archives, and old accounts began to reveal fragments of a much darker history than he had imagined. Years earlier, a tragic event had marked that house. An episode that shocked the local community and left deep scars on the memory of those who lived there at that time. Although many details were difficult to confirm, one thing seemed clear. That house carried a heavy past, a past that perhaps had never been fully resolved. When he returned home that night, the atmosphere seemed different. The silence was denser. Each step down the hallway echoed strangely, as if the house itself were reacting to what he had discovered. And at that moment, for the first time, a truly terrifying idea appeared in his mind. What if the strange events weren't just a coincidence, but a direct consequence of what happened in the past? The answer to that question was much closer than he imagined. And what he was about to discover could completely change everything he thought he knew about that house. After discovering fragments of the house's dark past, the property owner could no longer look at the place in the same way. Each room seemed to carry an invisible weight, as if the walls held memories that would never disappear. The nights continued to grow increasingly difficult. Sleep was constantly interrupted, and the feeling of being watched intensified with each passing night. What had previously seemed like mere discomfort began to transform into genuine fear. At a certain point, he realized he needed to make a decision. Staying there meant living with something he didn't understand, something that seemed to be growing stronger within his own home. Some accounts claim that after a while he simply decided to leave the property. The decision was quick, almost sudden, as if staying there for another night was unthinkable. A short time later, the house was empty again. Even so, the stories about that place never completely disappeared. Locals continued to talk about strange events associated with the property, keeping alive the mysterious reputation that surrounded the location. Over the years, that house has become one of the most talked about cases among curious people and researchers of unexplained stories. To this day, many people still wonder, could it all have been just a coincidence? Or was there really something in that place that should never have been awakened? Perhaps the whole truth will never be fully known. But one thing is certain, some houses hold stories that time simply cannot erase. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more mysterious tales like this, subscribe to the channel and leave your comments below. From which city or country are you watching this video? It's always interesting to see how far these stories go.